In this chapter, we're going to be learning all about server routes in Nuxt 3. We're going to refactor the app to, instead of serving our course data from a JSON file or a JavaScript file, instead we're going to be fetching that data from the endpoints. And then once we've done that, we'll then set up our database using Supabase and Prisma, and then we'll be able to put that data in our database and fetch it from there. And as we go through all of this, we'll start to learn about how routes work. We'll learn about useasync data and all the different ways that we can fetch data in Nuxt. We'll also learn Prisma and how to use that to fully type our database endpoints. And then at the end, we'll learn a lot more about Nitro and how Nitro powers so much of the magic and the amazing features that Nuxt gives us. In this lesson, we'll be taking a look at how server routes in Nuxt 3 work. We're also going to use a tool called Hopscotch to help us develop these routes. If you've ever worked on a server API, it can be really annoying to constantly need to go into our page and manufacture these fetch requests in order to test that the server is doing what it should. So there are tools like Postman and Hopscotch, which allow us to more easily test these endpoints. So in this course, we're going to be using this tool called Hopscotch. Hopscotch.io is where you can find it. And it runs in your browser, but lets you still make requests to your local host, which is really cool. It's also built using Nuxt, which I think works perfectly for this course. A fun fact for you is that Hopscotch used to be called Postwoman. And in the very first course that I created, Clean Components, I actually did a series of screencasts where we went into Postwoman and looked at the source code and did some interesting things there. So for me, this also makes a lot of sense to use this, and it's a great tool. So before we actually are able to use the tool Hopscotch, we first need to create our endpoint. So we'll do that using Nuxi. If we come over to our terminal, we'll type in Nuxi add API world. And you'll see that this was created in the server/API directory. And if we open this up, we can see that we use the define event handler method. And then inside of that, all that we're doing is creating this function that returns a string. So pretty straightforward. To see how this request works, we're going to create a collection in Hopscotch to organize all of these different requests that we're going to be making. So naturally, we will call it Mastering Nuxt 3. And then inside of there, we will do Hello World. And now you can see that we've got this request inside of Mastering Nuxt 3 folder. This green dot shows that we're active on the request. So that's a bit of a confusing part, or it confused me at least, with this UI, is that you need to make sure that this green dot is on. If you click on it a second time, then now we're not in any specific request. And the changes that you do will be for any new request you want to make. So make sure that you've clicked on this, and that it's showing that green dot. And then we can type in HTTP localhost 3000. And then our API lives at /API/world, the name of the file. So I hit send, and we can see that the response is hello world, exactly what we wanted. So I'll add an exclamation mark there. If we send it again, you can see that that updates in there. Okay, so that's the very most basic way of creating a server endpoint. All right, so now we've created the most basic endpoint that we could possibly imagine. One thing to know about the server is that all of these live in the /API directory. But this is actually a shorthand. It's equivalent to if we had the server/routes/API. So if I move that over, you can see that we're now server/routes/API. And if I send this request, we get the same thing back. So this lets us put any routes that we want in this server/routes folder. If we don't want this API prefix, we can move this into the top folder here, into routes. And then if we remove that from here, we get the same request back. And so you can see that the routing system here is actually the same as what we were using in our pages directory. And in fact, it's the exact same thing. We can even put in route parameters and optional segments the same way that we would with our page routing. But it's a good convention to keep our API routes prefixed with this API here. So we're going to move that back. And we'll use this shorthand instead, just because it's a little bit nicer and easier to work with. So now we need to create our actual API endpoints. So let's think through this for a moment. The data that we need to access in our course is the data for the current lesson that we're on. And so maybe we could create an endpoint for that, a lesson endpoint that matches the same endpoint or route that the pages are using. And the second thing that we need is some metadata about the course so that we can get a list of all of the lessons so that we can render the navigation on the left-hand side, as well as the name of the course, since we're using that on every single page. So we'll be able to create two different endpoints, a lesson endpoint and then a metadata endpoint. So we're going to jump into creating that lesson endpoint first. What we're going to do is create a matching route that will match this route that we have up here. So we'll do that in our API here. We'll do course/chapter/chapter slug/lesson/lesson slug.ts. And we'll want to use this define event handler in there. So now let's go over to Hopscotch and create a new request that will hit this endpoint. We're actually going to be creating a couple different lesson requests so that we can sort of test how we're using this endpoint. So we're going to create a new folder within this. Create our new request. And then here we're going to do API/chapter slug lesson slug. And I probably need to restart the server here. Oh, I forgot the course in the URL. That's what I missed. There we go. Now we received this back, so we know we've got this hooked up. Okay. I'm going to save this request. And one thing that we need to do first is to grab the chapter slug and the lesson slug from the route. To do that, we use the event context. Every single endpoint gets passed in this event object. And this object has the request and other details about it that we can grab. And most of the time, we're not actually going to deal with this event directly, but instead, there's a bunch of helper methods that we can use to pass this event into and help us work with it more easily. But for this case, it's pretty straightforward, so we're able to just deal with it directly. So now if I hit send, we see that we're getting this string back, lesson slug, and chapter slug. So that's exactly what we were looking for. We're able to grab the slugs off of the route, just like we were with the page routing earlier. Now we've seen how to create a basic server route. And in the next lesson, we will continue this and finish implementing our lesson endpoint. In this lesson, we will continue on implementing our lesson endpoint. So the next thing that we need to do is to be able to provide the course data from this endpoint. So we're not quite at the point yet where we want to integrate the database. That will come later in this chapter. So for now, we're just going to move the course data from the client side to the server. So we'll come into our composables here, and we'll copy that. And in the server directory, we'll paste that in. So this will let us import it. Course data. And now that we have the course data, why don't we call this course instead? We can actually reuse the logic from our route validation in order to find the correct chapter and the correct lesson based on the slugs. So we're just going to copy this whole thing here. We paste that in, but we don't need params here because we have the chapter slug and the lesson slug directly. And instead of returning abort navigation, we can just throw this error directly. Which will do the same here for the lesson. This is one of those cases where it's really, really convenient for us that the same things that work on the client side also work really well on the server side and in our server routes. So this create error method works just as fine in our Vue components as it does or on our server routes. And we don't have to worry about a different method, a different syntax, a different interface. We can copy and paste code around. And if we wanted to, if this logic got even more complicated, in theory, we could refactor this out into a separate utility method that's used both on the server route here as well as in our route validation. And of course, now that we have found the chapter and the lesson, we need to actually return that object instead of this string here. So we save that, and then coming back over to Hopscotch, we'll send this request again. And you can see that we do not find this because we get an error because we do not have the correct chapter. Now, this is actually great because it tells us that our endpoint is working as it should. One thing that's nice about Hopscotch and other tools like it is that we can create a bunch of different requests, and we can actually add in our own tests. There's a little tab here that lets us write some JavaScript code that will test the request and make some assertions on the request that or the response that we get back. Now, this, of course, does not replace automated testing, unit testing, integration testing, end-to-end testing, but it is a little bit better than manual testing and makes it a little bit easier for us when we do want to just click around and manually tweak some things and check that things are working the way that they should. So we're going to test this just a little bit just to see how this might work. So I'm going to rename this because we're not getting the first lesson. And I can come in here. There's these little snippets that make it really easy. If I change the size, then we can see what they are. A snippet to check the status code. And we want to check that the status code is 404. So we're actually going to do this. And if we save that and send, we can see in our test results that our test is successful, which is great. And we can add in more tests if we wanted to be more precise about what we're doing here. But instead, now that we've tested the error path, let's create a request to test the happy path. So we duplicate this request and we will edit it. And we'll make this one get first lesson. We'll remove that test because it no longer makes sense. And then in order to get the correct slugs, we can actually just cheat a little bit and grab this URL because we're using the exact same URL format. So I'll do /API and then paste in this route that we copied. And if I hit send, you can see that we get back the object that we were expecting. This is the lesson object that we need. And so one thing that we can do here is actually test a property on the response that we get back. So let's do that. And Hopscotch here isn't giving me enough room, so I'm going to decrease the size a bit there. So I'm going to check the title, and I'll just copy this. Hit save, and I'll send that. And if we come over in the bottom here to our test results page, we can see that our test passed with flying colors. Now, we're not quite done with our requests here because we have one issue. If I come in here, let me duplicate this first lesson here. And instead of get, If I change this to a post request, we see that our API responds correctly. But actually, this is not what we want. This endpoint should only respond to GET requests. So one way to do that could be to look at the event, check what method it is, and if it's anything other than a GET method, we could return an error code saying this is not implemented correctly. But of course, Nuxt has got us covered in that arena as well. All that we need to do is add the suffix .get. And this works with any of the HTTP method types. Once we add in .get and we try and send a post request to this endpoint, we get this error that method post is not allowed on this route. This makes it really, really convenient for us to implement the different methods on a single endpoint. So we can have one file that's for get. We could create another file and implement our post. We could do yet another file to implement the patch method. And so in that way, we're able to very easily separate out our methods without adding any extra boilerplate or overhead. And we don't need this file, so I'll just delete that. And there we are. We have seen in this lesson the basics of creating server routes in Nuxt 3. And we've created our first endpoint, the lesson endpoint. In the next lesson, we're going to take a bit of a detour and update our types so that we can make our endpoints more type safe. After that, we'll handle creating the course meta endpoint. In this lesson, we're going to see how to add types to this endpoint. We created types in a previous lesson for the use course composable. And we can take these and instead move them into this endpoint so that we're able to use those types there. But instead of moving them into the endpoint, we want to be able to use them in this composable as well as in our endpoint. So we're going to create a types folder. Inside that folder, we're going to create a course.ts file. And we'll copy in the types that we have here. We need to make sure to export all of these types so that we can import them into the use course composable. So to do that, we'll add in the export keyword. And then we'll import these types back into the composable. We can do that using this tilde, which references the root of our project. So we do the tilde/types/course. But we actually need to select the specific ones. So we grab lesson, chapter, and course. But now that we're importing these, we need to get rid of the local declaration here. So we can just remove that. And now we've got our types in a separate file. One extra thing that we're going to do to make things a little bit easier for ourselves is create a separate lesson type. One that has the lesson as we get it in the course data, and then one with this path added on. To do that, we'll remove this path property from the lesson type, and then we'll create a new lesson type called lesson with path. And here we can use the TypeScript intersection to take the lesson type and then add on some new properties. In this case, we're only adding on a single property. And what this intersection operator does is it basically just combines the two types together. So going back to use course, we'll also import the lesson with path. And we'll update our composable here to use that. Do lesson with path here. This is technically a lesson, just to be a little bit more explicit and clear in what we're doing here. And we'll also add the chapter type to this one here. It's not strictly necessary, but I like to put it in there just to make it a bit more clear what's going on here. One last thing we need to do is we need to go into this chapter type here. So this lessons property can be an array of lessons, but it can also be an array of this lesson with path. So we'll give this some flexibility here because later on when we go to update our endpoint, we'll need this to work in this way. Now that we've updated these lesson types, I also want to get a little bit fancier with some types and add in a utility type for us. I'm going to put this in a global type file because I don't want to have to import this specifically in each file. And in order to do that with TypeScript, we just need to create a file called global.d.ts. And in that file, we have to export here and then also declare this global namespace. And anything inside this global namespace will be global. And so we're defining a maybe type here. And what this does is it lets us take any other type represented by this T here, and that type could be either T, null, or undefined. And this makes it a little bit easier for us to deal with types where we might have the object or it might be null. So now we need to update the lesson endpoint with all of these new types. So we come over here. We need to first import all of our types. We'll paste in this import for our types. We'll put in this statement which turns our course into a course type. It doesn't actually do anything other than give TypeScript a hint that this object that we've imported is actually of the course type. We'll add the return type as a lesson with path. And then our chapter, we could put chapter here, but the problem is that if we come down here, it will show us this error message. And this message says that we have this whole long thing here, which is basically just telling us the chapter type or undefined. Because TypeScript is smart enough to know that what's returned from this find method could be nothing at all if the chapter was not found. So that's where this maybe type comes in handy. This type is maybe a chapter. And so if we hover over this, we can see that this chapter is indeed a maybe chapter. But then down here, we put this guard up. And so TypeScript knows that this either is a chapter or it's undefined at this point. But we're checking for that case with this if block here. So then now when we come down to this section over here, it's no longer undefined as a possibility. We know for sure that it is a chapter. TypeScript is clever enough to infer that through this logic, at this point in our code, this chapter variable must be of the type chapter because we've already handled that undefined case. And so that's why it's really useful to be able to have this maybe type in there. And we'll do the same for the lesson. Now, if we come down to our return, we can no longer simply return this object because it is of the type lesson. And what we want to return is lesson with path. But that's not a problem for us because we can just add on the path right here. We already know the chapter slug and the lesson slug. And now, because we've added on this property, we've satisfied that type, and everything checks out as it should. So if we come back over to Hopscotch, we can test this out. Once I switch over to the get request here, get first lesson, then I'll hit send, and we will get our first lesson, but we'll also have the path added onto it. And so why don't I just quickly add in another test here to make sure that we do get that path. Give myself some room here. And we'll check body.path to be, and then we'll just copy in this path because we know that this one is correct. We hit send, and we'll come over to our test results pane. And we can see that both of our tests now have passed. So at this point now, we have added our first server route to fetch the data for a specific lesson. And we've also added types to that endpoint so that we can make sure that we are fully typed and type safe and leveraging the full benefits of TypeScript. In our next lesson, we will build the endpoint for getting course metadata. In this lesson, we are going to be creating our course metadata endpoint. So we've already got our endpoint for the lesson itself, but in our app, we also have all of this other metadata that we need to access. We need to know the name of the course. We need to know the different chapters and the different lessons that we have in this course in order to render out this navigation on the left side here. So to do that, we'll create a course metadata endpoint. So we'll open up our folder here, and inside of the course folder, we'll add a new file. And since I always forget what exactly this method is called, we'll just copy and paste it in. Also, I'm too lazy to type, but that's okay. So for this endpoint, we're actually going to start it out the same way we did the other endpoint. And we need to grab all of these different types as well as the course data that we'll be using. Now, what we want to do is provide the course title as well as an outline of all of the different lessons. We don't want to provide the lessons with all of that extra data. We could just take this course JSON here and just return that. But of course, that's going to be way too much data, and we have no real need to send all of that over to the browser. To get started, we're first going to create the types that we'll need. Sometimes creating types first feels like a bit of a chore, but actually it's in a way like test-driven development. It forces you to think about your problem and to deconstruct it and break it down into smaller pieces. And once you've created the types that you need, you know that you've thought through the problem clearly, and then implementing it becomes much simpler. So we're first going to start with the types. Our very first type is the course meta. Now this is the type that we're going to return from this method or from this endpoint. As we said before, we know that we want the title and then an outline, which we'll call chapters. And we're going to create a separate type for us without any of the extra things that come with the chapter. And we're going to call that an outline chapter. To create this outline chapter type, we're also going to create an outline base type, similar to what we did with the lesson and lesson with path. So this outline base type will have the title, the slug, and then the number. If we go into our course types here, we can see that our lesson and our chapter both have a title, a slug, and a number. So these are properties that are common to both the lesson and the chapter, and data that we want to be included in our metadata. This is so that we can have the title here as well as the number in here. And of course, we also need the slug so that we can construct that path correctly. So coming back over to our meta endpoint, we have this outline base, and to create the outline chapter and the outline lesson, we use this intersection operator again. So the outline chapter is the outline base, but with this lessons property on it. And the outline lesson is the same, but it also has this path on there. So now we can start to see the structure of the data that we are returning. We're going to have this chapters, which is an array. And all that that array contains is another array of lessons. So now it's time to actually implement this endpoint. And in order to do that, we are going to make use of the reduce function, which is one of my favorite things. And at the end here, we will return the object, the course meta object. So let's quickly go through what this code is doing. So we have our reduce up here, and we've got previous and next, and then this function here that computes that. We're going to start with an empty array. So the types here actually help us to read the code because we can see that this reduce is going to return an array of outline chapters. So that means that this here must be itself an outline chapter, or an array of outline chapters, sorry. If you're not familiar with how reduce works, we first start with this initialized array, which in our case is an empty array. And for each item in this chapters array, we take the previous element and we get the next element. So in our case, we're going to start out with an empty array, which we will say is an outline chapter array. And we'll grab that first chapter. Then we compute all the different lessons from that, and then construct ourselves this outline chapter object. And once we have this outline chapter, we can then stick it onto the end of the array and keep going. Then when we get the next item, we have this array, which now has one chapter in it. And then as we go through the array, we keep adding these chapters to it. So how are we computing these lessons here? Well, here we're just mapping the lessons. And what we're doing is really mapping from a lesson with path type to an outline lesson type. So here is where we're really getting rid of all of the data that we don't need. This implementation could have also been done with two maps. If you are using something like Lodash or another utility library, they also have pick methods, and we could be using something like that. There are a lot of different ways to implement something like this, but this is how I have implemented it here. So now let's go over to Hopscotch to see if we're actually returning the data that we think we are, because that's always the important part. So I'm going to duplicate this request. And then I will move it out of that folder, and we'll edit the name. And then we need to edit the URL that we hit. And now we will run this. So the JSON that we get back is the title of the course, along with the chapters, which is an array. We get the title and the slug and the number for the chapter, as well as all of the lessons. But the lessons only contain the title, slug, number, and path. And as we scroll down, we can see that the structure of this data is, in fact, what we were hoping for. Now, in this particular case, the data is actually not a huge amount. So the difference between what this endpoint returns and what our course data file here is not actually that different. But you can imagine that if our text in the lesson is substantial, that this could actually mean a huge amount of data. Are you going to send over all 50,000, 100,000 words of content in a written course, or are you going to just return the metadata? That can be a pretty significant difference. So if we come over to our test results, we see that it actually failed. And that's because the title is incorrect. So let's update that. The title is not the title of the first lesson anymore, but in this case, the title of the course. So make sure to save that. And now our test runs successfully. In our meta endpoint here, we actually don't need these two types here. As you can tell from the syntax highlighting, they're grayed out. So why don't we just get rid of those before moving on? So now we have two endpoints. We've got the lesson endpoint and the course metadata endpoint. And these should be good enough for us to now transition into putting all of our data into a database and fetching it through our API. In the next lesson, we will look at setting up Prisma with our project so that we can then use a database from Supabase, put all of this course data in there, and use the database instead of a local JSON file. In this lesson, we'll begin to look at data fetching in Nuxt. So we spent the past few lessons building out our server routes and seeing how we can do that with Nuxt with all of the different tools that comes with Nuxt. And now we'll be able to create a couple different composables which will let us access that data really easily. In this lesson, we're going to start with the use lesson composable, which will let us access those lessons. So to begin, we'll create that use lesson file. And then we'll paste our composable code in here. Starting at the top, we will pass in a chapter and lesson slug. And this is what will allow us to grab the correct lesson that we're looking for. We then make a call to use fetch. This is the composable that lets us fetch data. And it's very similar to a fetch command, or the fetch command that you're probably already familiar with and using in other projects. But this fetch command is a little bit more powerful, and we'll return to that in a moment. But in this fetch call, we have our URL, which uses the slug for the chapter and the lesson slug. And then from that, we get our data as well as an error object. So before we return from this composable, we check to see if we have an error. And if we do, we can use this create error method, which we are now familiar with, to throw an error. Otherwise, we can simply return this data ref with the data that we've fetched. We'll use this composable in the lesson page instead of fetching it from the use course composable. So first we have to grab our slugs from the route. And then using those slugs, we can then pass them into the use lesson composable here. Now we need to make sure that we're using this await keyword because in our use lesson composable, we are awaiting this fetch command. And TypeScript is giving me an error now because we've already got this lesson variable defined. But now that we're getting our lesson from this endpoint, we no longer need to compute it from this value here. So we'll just get rid of that. And as you can see, as we click through our lesson here, we get the same outcome. In fact, it looks like nothing has actually changed. So to prove to you that we've actually done something useful here, I'll open up the network tab. And you can see that as we click through, we're making calls to our endpoint with these different request URLs. A different URL per lesson. And the response is the lesson object itself. So this is all pretty straightforward, actually. The use fetch composable is really easy to use. So let's explore a little bit more about this use fetch composable. One thing that's interesting about this composable is that it actually automatically will infer the type of the data that we get back. If I hover over this data, you can see that it knows that this is a lesson with path object, even though we've never specified this anywhere. And that's because it knows based on this route, it can match it up to the endpoint that we just created. When we want to type out the route, we have this autocomplete here because, again, it knows the types of the different routes that we have. And these are the only 3 valid routes that we have in our application. Right? So undo this, come back to our code that works. One interesting thing to note about this use fetch composable is that this URL here, while we have used a string here, you can also pass it a ref of a string, or even a function that returns a string, or a function that returns a ref of a string. And if you use a ref here, whenever the value of that ref changes, useFetch will automatically refetch your data for you. So in theory, we could change this from a string to a ref instead. And then in our lesson slug page here, we could create a computed prop that returns a string and then use that computed in this lesson. But I actually prefer this method here. Instead of passing in a generic string ref, we pass in the slugs, and then the composable itself will calculate what that URL should be. In this way, we don't have to carry around this structure for the URL ourselves. It's encapsulated nicely within this composable here. UseFetch isn't the only way that we can fetch data in our application. In fact, UseFetch is a wrapper around two other functions that are very useful in Nuxt. So we can create an equivalent version of this using the use async data as well as this $fetch. So I'll save this here and refresh. So you can see that as we click around on the side here, our data loads. And so these two implementations are actually functionally equivalent. They do exactly the same thing, but just with a slightly different syntax of doing it. So let's explore how this works. And we'll start with this $fetch. So this $fetch here is very similar to the fetch command that you are used to. It fetches data from a URL. But this command is isomorphic. And that's a really fancy, cool sounding word, but all it means is that it does the same thing on the client and on the server. You'll notice that a lot of the things we talk about in Nuxt actually do this, including this create error method and many other things, which simplifies our lives a lot. But in the case of the fetch command, we can use it on the client side as well as on the server, and it operates in the same way. Except there's one little catch here, and that is that when we're on the server, this $fetch will skip the whole HTTP request thing. Instead, since we're already on the server, this call here is in the same process as our server endpoints. And so this method here just gets directly called, as if it was just another function in our application. So we skip all of that HTTP overhead, which makes it much faster. One other thing that's great and that we've pointed out already is that this $fetch enables this wonderful automatic type inference. Technically, our server-side routes are running on a separate application on the server, and this fetch command is being run on the client side. And so they're actually two separate pieces of code. And so type inference between the two is not always that easy. And so Nuxt does a bit of magic for us and allows us to get this type inference. So we've explained what this fetch part does. But what about this use async data thing? Well, simply put, it lets us use asynchronous data. So any data that will resolve or that we'll have to wait to resolve. And we need to wrap it in this function because Nuxt needs to manage that and make sure that when we do server-side rendering, and then that gets hydrated and then rendered again on the client, that whole process works cleanly. And we want to make sure that we're doing things like deduplicating HTTP calls, so we're not making extra requests that we don't need to, that we're not making a request on the server and then on the client immediately making that same request, but that we're conserving and making things more efficient. So there's a bunch of different stuff going on under the hood here. But this use async data composable is really just a very generic way of handling asynchronous data. And all that we need is some sort of function, any function, as long as it returns a promise. And so that's what this fetch function does here, is it returns a promise, so we are able to use it in our use async data. And so we've shown that these two things here, use fetch and use async data with this fetch command, are functionally equivalent. So why do we have both of these if they do the same thing? Well, if you think about your applications that you're building, the vast majority of the async data that you're working with actually comes in the form of these fetch requests. And so to make that main use case as easy to use as possible, Nuxt combines these two things into the use fetch command. And so instead of using the use async data with the $fetch everywhere, which is a little bit more verbose, a little bit more complicated, we can just use the use fetch composable. Those edge cases where you're not directly using a URL might come from if you're using a library to fetch data, or you have some other functions that you're borrowing from another project or something like that, where you're not providing a URL directly, but instead getting some sort of promise from somewhere else. And so that's when the use async data composable is helpful. All right, so in this lesson, we went through the basics of data fetching in Nuxt, how the use fetch composable works, how use async data works with the $fetch isomorphic fetch. And we've described a little bit and gone through a little bit how these two things differ and when you might want to use one over the other. In the next lesson, we will dive a bit deeper into data fetching, and eventually we'll also add in a composable to fetch that course metadata, which we already created the endpoint for. In this lesson, we're going to look deeper into this data fetching in Nuxt. We're going to look at some important arguments of the use fetch and use async data commands, such as the key, the pick, as well as we will look at the lazy keyword. So if we come over to our API documentation here for use async data, so remember that use fetch actually wraps around use async data. So these have the same or very similar function signatures. You can see that we get a lot of different options here. We can pass in a server, a lazy, some default data, a transform function. We can give it a pick argument, a watch source, as well as this immediate flag. So there's a bunch of different things that we can do to configure how our data is being fetched. But there's one option that's really important as part of this use async data function here is the key. So if you look in the documentation, what this key does is it lets us properly deduplicate the requests. Now, in earlier versions of the Nuxt 3 beta, they did provide a cache along with this, but that had some issues, and so it was actually removed for the stable release of Nuxt. So to be clear, there is no caching except for on that initial page render. However, that's not really much of a problem for us because we can pretty simply create our own cache. So we're going to do that. We're going to use session storage as our cache. And this is because cache invalidation is a very tricky subject and not something I really want to get into in this course. But with session storage, every new session gets completely wiped out. And so that's a pretty good way of clearing out the cache and invalidating it. So we're going to stick with that. So we'll use the use session storage composable, which works in the same way as the use local storage composable that we used previously in this course. We'll have to make sure to import storage serializers as well as import our lesson with path type. And so what we're doing here is, first of all, we're just sticking this URL inside of a string so we can use it in a few different places. And then we're calling the use session storage composable. We're going to use the URL as the key so that whenever we go to a new URL, it will be a different spot in the cache, so that whenever we go back to the same URL, it will just retrieve that value from the cache. We're going to initialize this with null, and then this option we have to pass in because we're giving it a default value of null. The composable does not know automatically what object type we're going to be giving it. So we're just going to tell it we're using an object, and so when we give you an object, serialize it into a string to save in the session storage, and then when we want to get it back out of session storage, it has to take that string and then convert it back into an object. So if we gave it a default like this, then this is an empty object, and we wouldn't need to pass this in. It would automatically know, oh, this is an object, use the object serializer. But in our case, we want to initialize it to null because that simplifies things for us a little bit. And so then we just need to give it this hint. You'll also notice that we've got these funny little brackets here with the type in here. What this is doing is telling the composable that the type that we're using this with is the lesson with path type. And this is important because then the return type that comes back is a removable ref of type lesson with path. And so these angled brackets are basically, you can think of them as type arguments. So if removable ref is a function, this type here is an argument to that function. So that sets up our use of the session storage. And now this lesson variable here is a removable ref. This is the type that the session storage returns back to us. So if this value already exists, then lesson will be the lesson that we've already got. But if we haven't yet fetched from that, then it will be null. So we need to check for this. And so our use fetch and error handling here needs to be updated a little bit. And so what we're doing here now is we first check to see if we've hit the cache. And if we have a cache miss, then we need to fetch that data. So when that happens, we can call this. And here we're giving use fetch a hint that we are actually going to get back this lesson with path, because if we don't, then because we're passing in URL as a variable, TypeScript isn't quite intelligent enough to know and to infer that this URL is of the lesson with path type. And so because we have this variable here, then we just need to give it a little bit of a helping hand here. And then we've got our error handling as before. And then the crucial step here is that once we've fetched that data, we need to put it into the cache. And so updating this lesson value here with the data that we got back from our API will set the value in the cache. Because remember, this is a reactive ref. And so anytime we update this value, it will update what's stored in the session storage. I've also added a little message here so that if we're retrieving it from the cache, we'll just print out a little message so that we know that. And at the very end, we'll return our lesson. All right, so now let's see this working. So if I go to chapter 1, we see that the request comes through. If I go to chapter 2, that request also goes through. But if I go back to chapter 1, we get no request. And in the console, it will say we're getting lesson 1 from the cache. And so if we click around a bunch more, we'll see lesson 3 was already in the cache because that was the first one that we loaded. And there we go. And all of this loading here is actually from this Vimeo script. And that's not really anything that we can cache locally. So that will always take a bit of time to load. Great. And so now we've got a pretty straightforward and basic cache for this endpoint. So I mentioned this key value that we have in this use async data. And you'll notice that over here, we're not actually using the key value anywhere. And this is because by default, useFetch and useAsyncData will automatically generate the key for us based on the URL that we're using and the position of the call within the code. So most of the time, this does a great job for us. But if you do run into issues where data is being inconsistent, or you're suspecting that this deduplication is not happening, then we can pass in our own custom key. We can also use this pick parameter to only bring us the fields of the response object that we actually want to use. So many times, when we're fetching data from an API, the object that's returned has dozens, perhaps even more data fields. And often we only need 1 or 2 of those fields. And so 80% of that data that's coming over the wire is a waste. And we're wasting bandwidth and slowing down our app unnecessarily. Well, with this pick field, we're able to specify that we only want these 2 fields. And when we're on the server side, this means that the amount of data that we are hydrating with our app is much smaller. And it also means that the data object here is much easier to work with because we don't have all of these extra fields that we don't need to pass around everywhere. So if we save this, and now that we've got cached here, I have to create a new session. You can see that we're loading the number, so this renders correctly, and we're loading the title of the lesson, so this renders correctly. But because we're not loading the video ID or anything else, we're not able to get anything more in our lessons. So, not useful for us right now because we need all of the data that we're sending over. But a quick demo of how this pick function works nonetheless. The last option that I wanted to go through of the more important options is this lazy keyword here. Now, normally with this useFetch and useAsyncData, we have to put in this await keyword because we're going to wait, and this promise is only going to resolve once our data comes in. But in some cases, we actually want to continue along our execution here. And instead of waiting for this whole thing to render, we actually would prefer to put in some sort of loading state. Maybe that's a spinner, maybe that's a progress bar, or whatever it might be in your case. If we set lazy to true here, we can get rid of this await keyword. And then we can use this pending property, which will tell us if the data is loaded or not. And then you can use this pending property to switch between your loading state and your normal state. And because this behavior is common enough, we actually get a shorthand for this. Instead of needing to provide that lazy true, we can just use lazy fetch or use lazy async data. But in our case, we want to wait until that data is fully there, and so we'll use it in this regular way here. And so if we come over here, you can see that we've got use async data, but we also have use lazy async data and then use lazy fetch. And so if you want to check those out further, you can find those on the documentation. Now, before we wrap up with this lesson, I do want to point out one more time, just to make sure that it's super clear, is that this use fetch method is a wrapper around use async data. And so all of the options that we can provide to use async data, we can provide to our use fetch command as well. And because use fetch uses that $fetch under the hood, we also get all of those options as well, including method, base URL, and so on. So now we've seen not only the basics of data fetching in Nuxt 3, but also some more advanced ways that we can control how our fetching works, including how we can build a simple but effective cache on top of our data fetching. In the next lesson, we're going to continue on and finish up our data fetching and fetch data from the course meta endpoint. In this lesson, we're going to take this use lesson composable that we have already created, and we're going to turn it into a more generic composable. So right now, this function or this composable lets us fetch data from the lesson endpoint, but we also want to fetch data from our course meta endpoint. And we'd like to be able to do it in a similar way using this session storage caching layer that we've put on top of this data here. So what I'm going to do is actually to copy and paste this into a new file, and then we'll modify it from there. So now we're working in our use fetch with cache.ts file. Now we're going to work through and make this more generic so that we can use it with any endpoint that we want. So the first thing that we need to do is, instead of passing in slugs here like this, we're going to instead pass in the URL straight up. And we'll specify that that is still a string. Then, of course, we can get rid of that line. And now we're going to rename this lesson here. And we're just going to call it cached, because that's a bit more generic term here. Say cache.value, cached, and we'll return the cached value. We'll update our status message to be a bit more generic as well. And then this message here, when we have a cache hit, will also make this more generic. So now we have a pretty generic composable that we can use with any URL, and it will automatically give us this session storage cache layer. But one issue that we have is that we're still using this lesson with path type. Luckily, TypeScript gives us a way to create more reusable functions using generic types. You can think of these sort of like arguments for types. And so that's exactly what these arguments are doing here, or these angle brackets are doing here. This use session storage is a generic composable, and we can pass in any type to it to tell it what type to expect. And we're going to make our function here work exactly the same. So right up here, we're going to put a t, and this means that this is the type of this function. And then instead of lesson with path, we'll replace that with this generic type t. The name here doesn't really matter. You can name it whatever you want, but t is a common variable name. It's used for this generic type. And basically what this lets us do is say that whatever type we want to use this composable with, we just pass it in here. And then we'll take that type, we'll pass it along to this use session storage. And then this use session storage knows that this cached value here is a removable ref of type t, whatever t happens to be, of course. And our entire function continues on in this way, that use fetch of type t. So we're going to get data back that's of type t, and we continue on. Now in this spot here, TypeScript has a little bit of issues with figuring out what's going on here. And so one trick that we can do with TypeScript is to cast from one type to another. So in this instance, TypeScript doesn't know exactly what type data.value is supposed to be. But from looking at this code, I can say that data.value is for sure going to be type t, because it's coming from this use fetch here. And so I'm basically just going to override whatever TypeScript thinks is going on here and tell it that for sure data.value is type t, so therefore we can set it to cache.value. Now this as casting here can get you into some trouble because you are overriding TypeScript. So if you override it incorrectly, then you're basically shooting yourself in the foot and invalidating all of that value that TypeScript is there for in the first place. Okay, so now we have our cached generic composable for fetching data. Now we need to refactor use lesson to use this instead. And it's actually very straightforward. In fact, what we're going to do is remove this import here because we do not need that. And so the first thing that we need to do is basically get rid of all of this. We do need to create our own URL here to pass in. But we can call use fetch with cache and then use the template as an argument there. Now, this is where the generics come in again. Because we have not provided the lesson with path type, TypeScript does not know what this value is, and we get this unknown here. So just like we did with the use session storage method, where we passed in this type t, we're going to do the same thing here. We can pass in the type lesson with path. And now we're able to infer that this fetch here will pass in a lesson with path, and what we're going to get back is a promise that contains a removable ref of type lesson with path. We can also get rid of that import that we don't need, and we're good to go. Now that we have this use fetch with cache composable, we can now use it to fetch data from our course meta endpoint, which we'll do in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to take our use course composable that we have been working with throughout this course, and we will refactor it to use the use fetch with cache composable that we just created. We'll also have to refactor a bunch of little things throughout our app so that we can use these new endpoints correctly with the rest of our application. So to get started, we're going to move into our use course file. And we have a lot of stuff going on here because we're taking this course data and then mapping it and adding different path to it, adding types to it. But now that we're having an endpoint that does this for us, we can get rid of most of this. In fact, this use course composable becomes this very simple line here. This is all we need in order to fetch the data from this endpoint. The useFetchWithCache composable handles all of that other stuff for us, except that we need to do one more thing in order to finish this. And that is we need to add the type. And the type here we know is course meta. But we have to import this from somewhere. And currently, this course data type is only defined in this meta endpoint. So what we need to do is pull out these types and move them into our type file that we have created. So we'll grab these and open up our course types file. And then we'll add them in at the bottom here. And then these last ones here, we need to export as well so that we can use them in other parts of the application. Now that we've moved these types out of the endpoint, we now need to import them back in. Now that we've done that, the types in this endpoint should be good to go. And then we just need to import the course meta type from there. And this is all that we need to do to re-implement this use course composable. Now that we have this handy useFetchWithCache composable that does some nifty things for us, as well as our course meta endpoint. The next step is to refactor the rest of our application in order to use these two new endpoints correctly. So we're getting data, but we're getting data in a slightly different way than we were before. So that requires us to make a couple little changes throughout the app. First, we'll go with the use first lesson. And one thing that we need to do is that use course is no longer a synchronous composable. It returns a promise. And so we need to make sure that we await on this. So we'll add this async keyword to the function so that we can add in this await keyword. And then we are getting a ref back now. So we can't destructure immediately off of that. Or at least I prefer to not do that. And now we add in course.value.chapters.lessons, and this works as it should. Now that we've changed the interface of this use first lesson composable, we'll need to update every instance that we use this composable as well. So we'll first go into our course page here where we use the use course composable. And again, we'll add in the await keyword. We'll change this to course. And then where we use chapters and title, we have to update. So we'll put in course.title here. And then course.chapters. And in this component here, we're not using the use first lesson composable yet. But what we want to do is navigate to this first lesson here. So it makes sense that we should, while we're at it, just refactor this part here. Now we've tidied this up nicely. And one thing that's interesting that you'll note is that, yes, we are calling use course in here, and then use first lesson immediately will call use course itself. But because of the caching that we've added in, and the caching that use async data provides, we won't ever make multiple calls one after the other to an endpoint. So that's it for the course page. Let's move on to the lesson page. In this one, we have a few things we need to update as well. We need to put an await on this use course here. And in our middleware, we need to put an await on our use course, which requires us to also make this function async. And now that course is a ref, we need to add .value to this. And lastly, down here where we use the course to find the chapter, we'll add the value in there as well. And in the title. Almost missed that one. The last page that we need to refactor is the login page. So let's head over to that one. Same thing as before. I'm going to do await. Replace this with the course. And then we just need to pop in course.title and we're good to go. The one last thing we want to do before we wrap up with the data fetching section of this chapter is to get rid of this course data file in our composables. Now that our data is all provided to us from our endpoint, we don't need to have any of the data shipped to the client. All of that data can stay on the endpoint on the server. Okay, so we're going to restart the dev server to make sure we've got the latest code changes. And because we've got caching based on our session, we'll create a new session. And as we click around, things are appearing to work as they should. We can log out. It says log in to TypeScript with Vue.js 3, which is the title of the course. So that's great. And something looks like it broke here. Why is this link not clickable? I forgot to update the index page here. Okay. So once we do that, then we refresh this, and now this is actually a clickable link. And there we go. We have now refactored our app so that it works correctly with all the endpoints that we created, those 2 endpoints. So now the data is not shipped with our client bundle, but instead lives on the endpoint. And all of the data that we're accessing, we access through these API endpoints. The next step is now to move that data from our endpoints and move it into a database. So that's what we'll be tackling in the next couple of lessons, setting up our database, setting up Prisma so that we can access our database in a nicely typed way, and then fetching that data from our database in our endpoints instead of using the local files that we've currently been using.